Okay, I just finished grading chapter 16 and things went less well than I had hoped. So I'm going to go through the entire exercise so that way you guys can see what my thought process is. I think the key to finding the code is to know how to use the alphabetical index, and I think that's kind of a weakness right now. So that's what I'm going to focus on. The first word that I look up I'm going to highlight in yellow. Any subterms, second words will be red, and then if there's a third word I'll do it in green. And then I'll kind of talk through as I'm looking up the ICD-9 code. The first thing I have is an acute gastric ulcer with massive GI hemorrhaging. So the first word I'm actually going to look up is ulcer. Now, potentially, I have two codes here because I have the word with. And typically when you have with, you've either got a combination code or you have two codes that you're going to list. So if I look up ulcer, scarlet fever, shock, still on the S's, now on the W's. Look up and upset. The second word that I'm going to look up is probably going to be gastric. So ulcer, gastric, gastric, it says C ulcer stomach. So just so we know, C ulcer stomach. And if I look in ulcer stomach, I've got anything eroded, peptic, round. Now I'm going to look for acute. Okay, now right off the bat, right underneath stomach, I've got with, and then I've got acute. Now it says 531.3, but if I look right under acute, it says with hemorrhaging. So it says 531.0. There's a black check mark there. So right now I have accounted for every word: acute, gastric, ulcer, GI hemorrhage. Massive is just a descriptor on GI hemorrhage, and there's no differentiation between massive or minor. So then I look up in the tabular index 531.0, and I have to see whether there's any mention of obstruction or not. So there's no mention of obstruction, so that's going to be a fifth digit of 0. So my answer is going to be 531.00. Now if I read back this, it's gastric ulcer, acute with hemorrhage, without mention of obstruction. And that is indeed the right answer. Okay, going on to the next code. Incidentally, somebody had mentioned that it's easier to look through the tabular system for the tabular index for the homework. I would not recommend that for two reasons. Number one, it gets you into the habit of looking at the tabular index first. And second, if you don't look in the alphabetical index, there's a really good chance you'll miss those combo codes and that you will get the answer wrong because of not knowing that the combo code existed in a separate part of the same table. Okay, so here I've got ulcer. I know that's gonna be my first word, and duodenal is probably gonna be my second word. Oops, second word, not third word. Sorry about that. Okay, so ulcer, esophagus, dysenteric, duodenum, duodenal. Okay. Now I've got with hemorrhage, yes, and perforation, yes. So right off the bat, I know I'm looking at 532.6 because then the fifth digit's going to determine whether there's obstruction or not. So if I look up at 532.6, 532.60, or sorry, 61. So it should be 532.61. And that is indeed the right answer. Okay, penetrating gastric ulcer. Again, I think you can see kind of a theme here. First word is going to be ulcer. And usually the second word is going to be some part of the anatomy. So, ulcer, gastric, well, I know from the previous problem that I'm going to have to do ulcer stomach. So I'll just bypass that and look there right away. Stomach, penetrating. So stomach, ulcer, penetrating, perforation would be 531.5. There's no mention of any hemorrhaging, so I'm not going to take the subterm. And then there is no mention of obstruction, so my initial code I'm thinking is going to be 531.51. 531.51. Now again, I always look it up in the tabular index to make sure there's no exclusions there. It also helps a lot of times if you read it back. So I've got 531.51. Now I'm going to read the entire description, which is gastric ulcer, chronic or unspecified, with perforation, without mention of obstruction. Now that accounts for all the words that I have here, and it just fits. So 531.51. Oh, my bad. There's no mention of obstruction. I got my digits switched up. So 531.50. Okay, bleeding gastric ulcer. Well, again, we know ulcer is going to be the first word. We know that gastric is probably going to be the second one, although it's going to turn us to stomach. And then bleeding is going to be my last word. Okay, so ulcer, stomach, with hemorrhage, I know is 531.4 something. Okay, and there's no mention of obstruction, so I'm assuming that's going to be 0. And then if I look at 531.40, I get gastric ulcer, chronic or unspecified, with hemorrhage, without mention of obstruction. Okay, I'm just going to double check my answer, make sure I'm doing it correctly. And again, that's the right code. Okay, so in the next little video segment, we'll go on to 16.2. I want to make sure these are short enough. To get the most out of these videos, I'd recommend you have your homework with you and your ICD-9 book, not the textbook, but the actual reference book, and that you go through these and kind of see what the thought process is and what the flow is.